This is a Going Back, Remembering UGA interview with Dr. Rob Williams. Today is May 9th, 2011, and we're in the Visitor Center at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. Rob, thank you so much for being with us today. I also want to thank Bill Evelyn today for being behind the camera and helping us make this happen. Rob, going back, let's go back to your early days. Is it true that you were a Manchester, New Hampshire born fella? That's where you started?
That's right, Fran. I was a military brat, but all my roots are in New England.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your family, about your growing up years, and as a military brat, I take it you were all over the map?
All over the place. Went to 13 different schools before I graduated from high school.
Goodness.
We moved on average every 9 months.
Wow.
Sometimes it was to a foreign country, but sometimes if Dad had what they called hardship tours, where he had to go alone, we'd go back to New England, or after a while to Augusta, Georgia. Dad was military police. The home of the military police corps at that time for the U.S. Army was at Fort Gordon. So that's sort of where I developed my Georgia connection.
I was going to ask how in the world you got to the University of Georgia with all that, but I understand that you went to Richmond Academy and your name was Cruncher, is that right?
You really do know all the secrets. That's correct. I did go at least 1 year to Richmond Academy.
I'm afraid to ask where Cruncher came from. Were you a bruiser or just?
No, you know, there was here's how I think it came to be. There was a technique by which you could open in the school lunchroom cafeteria small bags of potato chips, which were, you know, they were sealed but they had air in them, and if you cupped your hands just right and popped them just right, you could pop the bag open. I think I had a tendency to crunch them rather than to open the bag.
Has that skill stayed with you through the years?
I can still do it. Yeah, I can still do it.
About early influences in your life, what?
Well, when you move around a lot, I think you have a couple, 3, 4 choices when you move into new settings all the time. And for me, my choice of behavior was to sort of be a watcher and a listener. And I think I became very good at reading social systems, sort of coming to understand you know, what the mores or the norms were, and never really integrating, but sort of becoming good at watching and understanding people. So I think that's part of what travel gave me. I think the other part, Fran, was when you traveled internationally, it changes your whole perspective about the U.S. You live in places where the standard of living, we were in post-World War II Japan, and still suffering sort of you learn a very different set of values, I think. And the third thing is a woman wrote a book called The Children of the Fortress, and it's about kids who grow up in the military. She has this very poignant passage in there, which I remember very well, in which she asked this question: what other kids grow up in America when at 5 o'clock in the afternoon a cannon sounds and you drop your bicycle or your baseball glove and bat and stand at attention as they lower the flag? It is very much a place where you're sort of reminded of almost, you know, patriotic values. And I guess the third thing is service. It was not uncommon in our family when Dad would receive orders that there would be this discussion of why he had to go someplace. And again, something I think a lot of kids don't grow up with.
Very well said, Rob. Let's go back. Talk a little bit then. You were all over the world, certainly all over the country. And so while in Augusta, you decided that Athens, Georgia may be the place you wanted to spend the next 4 years, or?
No, it was financial, Fran, pure and simple.
I certainly understand that.
There were 4 of us in the family, and the commitment from my parents was that we would get 2 years college paid for, and we had to work for the other 2 years. And when I compared going back to either the University of New Hampshire or the University of Vermont as an in-state student, it cost me less, significantly less, to go to the University of Georgia as an out-of-state student.
We're still, I think, ranked in one of the best values in the country,
Yeah.
although that may be changing here shortly.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the fall of 1965. As you may have visited campus off and on while you were in state, but what first days on campus, orientation, lining up at the time, I remember we lined up outside Stegman Hall, and this was the old Stegman Hall, not the Coliseum.
Right.
IBM cards. Talk a little bit about first reaction to the University of Georgia campus.
I had never been on campus before, and our orientation was to go to fine arts. Every freshman gathered in there together. It wasn't early in the year, it wasn't a special session. I think it was just the day before classes started. And Dean Tate, Dean McBee, maybe Southern Sims, or at that time I think it was Jack, there was another Dean.
Sorrells.
Jack Sorrells may have been Dean of Students, but they spoke to us, reminded us about behavior, a lot of caution about the potential sins of Athens, Georgia, and the university campus. That was about it. But I just remember being there, the whole freshman class, no real sort of personal contact or anything. I do remember Reed Hall, which was the place I lived when I first.
Your first home in Athens?
My first home in Athens. And it was I had never been on the campus before, so it was very different. I remember the first day when my parents brought me up here, the one thing that I really kept from that period of time was a red Georgia blanket. I do remember that from my bed in Reed Hall, but it was a very different experience. So,
the campus certainly has changed physically since that time, but Reed Hall still is right in the middle of things, and that was a great place to be.
It was, yeah.
As I recall, it was boomers coming to school, and they had to take over. I think Clark Howell had to become a women's dorm. So there were a lot of us.
Yeah.
And what a great time. What a great time in our lives. Talk about living in Athens throughout your time here in terms of Athens residency. Did you stay in the residence hall, or did you?
I stayed in Reed Hall for 1 year, because I came to know him later, my freshman men's counselor was Bill Bracewell, who later ended up working for Dean Tate. And later in years, as we were on university faculty together, I actually knew him and worked with him. And there was a particular series of days in which Bill Bracewell finally thought he had to call me down to his office, in which he had made a notation that I was the social butterfly of Reed Hall, and the notation continued because I was always opening and closing doors. Now, I've asked Bill about that many years later, and he really can't remember why he thought he should so identify me, but that Reed Hall was a place where it was just chaos all the time, noise and everything else. But I stayed there a year. After that, I pledged a fraternity here on campus and moved in and lived in the Chi Phi house.
That was a broadening experience.
That was a broadening experience for sure. So
we're going to talk about that. Where'd you eat?
I ate in Snelling. I think that was the days of the sort of mandatory meal plan. So I think it was Snelling part of the time, but then it was also over in the high-rise complex. There was another dining hall over there. But
was the Bulldog Room underneath?
The Bulldog Room.
Right, Memorial Hall
yeah,
at the time.
the
that was
Bulldog
a place
Room.
To hang out.
Kind of hang out. I remember it from later years, not as much from being a freshman, but.
Freshmen couldn't have cars at that time.
No.
How did you get around?
Right. I will have to say I didn't have a car before I left home, so it was not a big shock to me.
Used to it.
No, it was not a big shock to me. And there was no bus system on campus. In fact, it was years later in '69 when we first started the bus system here on campus. So it was basically walk where you wanted to go. The campus was a lot smaller, so you could cover most of really what was the core campus pretty easily on foot. In terms of it, but then you would always be begging rides like back to Atlanta, which is where my parents were at that time at Fort McPherson, But I can remember you always had to be very work hard at making sure you had transportation.
Make those connections.
Yeah, that's right.
I had a class, I remember, in the women's PE building, which at the time was, as you know, on South Campus over near the Georgia Center, and then I had a English class on the 3rd floor of Park Hall.
Right.
And I don't remember that the bridge was there yet. Was the bridge there?
The bridge was not there my first year here.
I remember just running full out by the time I got to...
Down the stairs
oh
and
my
back
gosh,
up.
by the time I got there, I was passed out. Everybody in the class used to laugh because
Right. That's a funny...
I did not look like a Vogue model by the time I got there.
No, that was very true. And that was a funny part about Bill Tate. I remember once a student was turned in for excessive tardiness in class, and Dean Tate asked him what the problem was, and he gave the story basically. He had to go from South Campus to North Campus, and he just couldn't make it in time, at which point Bill Tate walked him out. They walked to where one of the classes started, and they clicked the watch, and Bill Tate walked him to that other class and made it in under 15 minutes, and then denied all of his...
No excuse.
No excuse.
Of course, Dean Tate was a cross-country runner, so that's hardly fair. Well, we'll talk, as I said, we'll talk a little bit more about Rush in just a minute, but fashionable male attire in the fall of 1965.
Yeah. Well, khaki pants. I remember that there were, almost every shirt was a button-down, cotton Oxford type of shirt. Had to have the loop in the back. There was a pleat in the back, and the higher brand shirts, more costly shirts. Lots of coats and ties. Now, I don't remember wearing coats and ties ever to class, but we wore them to football games. So coats and ties would be very necessary.
I'm trying to remember if Madras, there
Yes.
was a little bit of Madras, there was a little bit of maybe Weegens with no socks.
That's
there was
right,
something
yeah.
very cool about that.
Seersucker.
Yeah.
Yeah, seersucker.
I walked through the mall
Izod golf shirts.
the other day and thought, when I saw the cut-off jeans with the holes in them and the baggy ones, I thought times have changed. And in fact, there's a quote in here about that later too, Robert. We're going to talk about let's talk a little bit about academics. You're an English major in undergrad?
I was an English major in undergrad. Basically, pre-law was my goal, and I think I decided that pretty early. I remember concentrating English by my sophomore year. I think I was certainly in that direction. My first quarter of my freshman year was not pretty. I was a very good student and had tested high coming in, and so I took a lot of advanced courses my freshman year. Most of those I did okay in. French, I had exempted to French 104. So, yeah, so my first quarter, I was taking French 104 and not doing well at all. In fact, by the mid-quarter, I was failing it. And it's my first time to visit with Dean Tate. Dean Tate, you get these little notes. That's how you knew you had to go to his office. There wasn't a phone call. It was handwritten note saying you had to come to his office in your campus mailbox. And so, he knew your class schedule, and any time other than your class schedule was an open time, and there was not a call my office and make an appointment. There was a date and a time to be at his office. So I went to his office, sat on the mourner's bench that was outside where all of us spent a few minutes at least when summoned to see Bill Tate. Went into his office, and he basically was reviewing my academic record, what had been going on that quarter. And looking back on it, I would guess I was amazed that here was an individual who obviously kept track of freshman students in their academic performance. And then he zeroed in on French and asked what the problems were. I basically said it was just one of those, I had tested well on the written part, and French 104 was almost entirely verbal, and I just wasn't doing well on speaking it and hearing it. And toward the end of that, he said to me, he hoped I would do better, he hoped I would pass it, which I didn't manage to do by the end of the quarter and had to drop back and repeat. But in his final words, he pulled a book off his bookshelf. As all of us know, he's an incredible reader, had books from everywhere. And it was a copy of the Psalms in French. And he handed it to me and said, he said, here, I thought this might help you in your French class. And I didn't have the heart to tell Dean Tate that I didn't know the Psalms in English, say nothing about in French. But that was
what an incredible story.
Yeah, my first.
Because, Rob, there must have been how many people in our class? 2,000?
At least. And so he obviously was keeping track, or had, some of his staff who were looking to flag students. And I guess the fact that here was a student who was in mostly honors courses and just flunking French completely. So
what an incredible story, and what a wonderful connection.
Yeah, the first.
The first of many?
The first of many. It was also on that visit. It may also have been that Bill Bracewell's note about being the social butterfly of Reed Hall had also drawn some attention. Yeah, no telling what had brought the bullseye to me. But in that conversation, he encouraged me to get into campus politics. He said that would be a good outlet.
He saw that potential in
you. So he saw that outlet.
Omniscient.
Yeah.
So if I ask you about influential, memorable faculty or staff,
there were many. Certainly he was one. Marion Montgomery in the English department.
Was the class I was running to get to from
Yeah,
PE.
Is that right? Yeah. Marion Montgomery was phenomenal. Phenomenal human being. Marion Montgomery, I think, again, was one of those consummate teachers. George Marshall, who later went on to do many things with the Board of Regents, but another person, I was actually taking him for Old English literature the spring that I ran for student body president. And the morning after the election, when I walked into class, he said to me, the bearer of rings, which was in Beowulf, what they called the king. He was also the one who taught me that there were 27 ways to say at bat. He had been a sports reporter in Nashville, Tennessee. George Marshall and Marion Montgomery, but more George Marshall, was my connection to the Southern agrarians, who became really to me, it's where I fell in love with the South, was through the writers, the Southern agrarians, who were writing about a very changing landscape in the rural South. Marion Montgomery, in my junior year, said to myself and one other person one afternoon, after we'd finished class, had a sort of a late afternoon class with him that quarter, he said he was going to drive to Milledgeville to see Flannery O'Connor's mother. Would we like to go with him?
Are you serious?
Yeah.
How cool.
So we hopped in his car. He had known Flannery O'Connor, and of course the mother after Flannery's death from lupus. So we did. We jumped in the car and drove to
Andalusia?
We went to Andalusia. The farm is still there, as you know. It's on the Milledgeville Highway. Drove in. The peacocks were screaming, which is such a poignant, prevalent part of her books. And then spent about 2.5 hours with the mother. She made us coffee. We sat in the living room, kind of a farm, and just talked. And Marion was asking her in particular about, because he was working on something on Flannery O'Connor, something about her time in New York and the writing that she did there and everything. And of course, we just sat there spellbound. So
I should have been following you around. I think you had a different, your path was more interesting, I think, than mine. Let's talk a little bit about extracurricular life, and you certainly had a full, rich one of those. Let's start with fraternity life in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
We've all seen Animal House, which I just saw again the other night, and it is reminiscent in some degree to what life was like. Talk a little bit about life at the Chi-Phi House.
Well,
or Rush. Let's start with Rush. When you went through Rush, did you know what you wanted to do?
Well, and let me really start before that, because that's where the tale begins. Okay. We talked about the fact that I went to Richmond Academy and that I lived in Augusta for a while. And my college roommate was from Augusta, a friend I had met at Richmond Academy. And so before coming to Georgia, the spring before, I had been in Augusta and had spent some time with a couple of Chi-Phis who were down there selling master's tickets.
Mm-hmm.
In the spring of 1968, a few Chi-Phis went and printed up fake master's tickets. Now, it wasn't hard to fake a master's ticket back then. It was basically laminated plastic and a bobby pin or a safety pin. And they were selling them to basically, or giving them mostly to friends who were college students, but they made the mistake of selling a few. Now, the understanding I had as all of this came out was that the master had never been that bothered by the fact that people had fake master's tickets, because I guess we went in and we bought hot dogs and beer or whatever else. The Masters was a big thing, but not like it is today, not at all. But these particular Chi-Phis had made the mistake of selling some of these tickets, which was a federal offense.
Yeah.
Or I mean, it was, and
it's
so
a big deal.
It was a big deal,
Yeah.
and I probably should have brought this morning. Years later, Dean Tate gave me 2 of the tickets
Is
he had
that right?
confiscated. So I have 2 of those tickets. That someday they probably go into some sort of museum.
The Smithsonian.
But that's where I had met many of the Chi-Phis, and even though when I rushed they were off campus on probation because of the ticket scandal, I did pledge them in the fall of 1965.
And you moved into the Chi-Phi house your sophomore year, is that
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And the Chi-Phi house, of course, on Lumpkin Street,
Right.
top of the hill right there.
Right.
What was life like in the Chi-Phi house?
Well, it's it's probably many of those things like Animal House. I remember this part of it. It was basically chaos 24 hours a day. Somebody was always up doing something. Now, I will have to say in the defense that sometimes we were up studying. We really were up studying, but there was always somebody sort of up. They had a great kitchen, a wonderful kitchen. In fact, Diane, who later became my wife, who was a KD up here, probably ate every collegiate meal she ate on campus from her sophomore year on at the Chi-Phi house. So it had a great meal plan. The house is very broad in the front. It presents itself to Lumpkin Street, a very broad house, and it's basically 2 bedrooms thick. So there was not a lot of sleeping space there, but for those of us who did sleep in the house, I do just remember it was always K-Hall.
Did you, how many fellas to a room?
There were 2 of us to a room in bunk beds, believe it or not, in bunk beds. So the same college roommate I had at Reed Hall, Bob, and I roomed together when we were in the Chi-Phi house, at least for the first year. I then became an officer in Chi-Phi because they would pay your housing and your meals if you served as an officer. And again, money was pretty tight. So that was actually, I never paid that much to be in a fraternity. I actually got paid to be in a fraternity because
Oh, nice.
yeah, they paid by.
But you stayed at the house then?
I stayed at the house until was elected to president of the student body in the spring of '68, and that fall I did find that I just couldn't take the chaos anymore.
Getting old.
Getting old, I guess.
No, we'll talk a little bit. Let's talk about the campus politics. And one of the things that I remember is that for so long there had been a Greek party and an independent party.
Right.
Talk a little bit about the way things changed during the course of the 4 years that we were there and what transpired then when you ran for office.
Well, obviously this country, many things were changing. One of those things, I mentioned my dad was a military police officer, and in 1965, an African-American Army Reserve officer named Lemuel Penn left Fort Benning in Columbus, Georgia with 2 of his friends to drive back to Washington, D.C., where he was a school principal, reservist Army officer doing his summer duty. He had been a veteran in World War II, combat commands. They made the mistake of stopping in Athens, Georgia on Broad Street at a gas station that was still there when I was a student. It's gone now, to fill up their car. And unfortunately, that station was a hangout for local Ku Klux Klan members. They then left Athens, and they were in uniform. They actually changed out of their uniforms in Athens into civilian clothes. They then got back in their car and proceeded. And of course, it was a back roads trip back then. There were no interstates. And as they crossed the Broad River, on the bridge over the Broad River, that a car following them pulled alongside, and shotgun blast killed Lemuel Penn. That was Madison County, so he was taken to the Madison County funeral home, which was next, fairly close to where the sheriff's office was. So my dad got a call, and he woke me up and said he wanted me to, it was probably 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, to drive with him in our family car. And the reason being, he did not want to take a military vehicle just for fear of sort of making it look like a military presence. And Dad was in his civilian clothes. And we drove up there, and I remember asking him, why was I going with him, basically? And he said, because he was going to ride back in the hearse. And he said, in the Army, it's a tradition, you never allow a deceased soldier to travel alone. And then I would drive the family car back. So we got there in front of the sheriff's office, and I remember the funeral home to the side, and he said he would go in the sheriff's office first. So got out of the car and told me to stay in the car. And I was very naive. I had no idea what the degree of racial tension was in the South at that particular time. I went inside. I stayed in the car for a while. It took a long time, and I remember finally just had to go to the bathroom. So I got out to go in to use the restroom in there, and I remember walking in and asking where the restroom was. There was kind of a desk with one of the sheriff deputies, and he pointed down the hall. And as I stepped down the hall to go to the restroom, my father and that sheriff were at the end of the hall. And my father was saying to him in a voice that I had experienced a few times with a very steely tone, "Don't you ever use that word again. You will refer to him as Colonel Penn and only as Colonel Penn. And if you ever use," and then he repeated two variations of the word Negro used as slurs. And he was face to face with that sheriff. And that was probably the first time I was aware of what was happening in America. And that then, at 65, many of the Civil Rights Act was passed. There was a time of great change. And I think while college campuses were islands. They were not society. They were islands. They were still, to some degree, privileged elites.
No question, it was a world all its own, and the things that went on outside really were not what you were caught up in.
No, except as you read them, read about them, and as you went to class. And Will Power was my religion teacher, philosophy and religion, and when he would talk about or John Granrose and ethics, they would talk to you about these things. You realize that you can talk about it as an academic subject, but things were happening out there that were the manifestations of those ethics and values, or were the violation thereof. So I think that what was beginning to happen on the campus were things like kids like me who were kids the year before they entered college, but at age 18 they became draftable. They were individuals who were experiencing this change in civil rights, and I'm sure sat at tables in Atlanta on the north side or in Savannah and listened to parents talk about the abomination of mixing races. Well, it just didn't fit with what we were learning. And I remember those discussions in classrooms, that the world we had experienced and the world we were supposed to be experiencing, they just didn't match. And I think that disconnect was no more prevalent than when you looked at a Greek society on the campus, and SDS, which had started to form, Students for Democratic Society. I worked one summer teaching literacy programs with SNCC, Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Well, they were nonviolent back then. They were young African American men and women who were just teaching literacy because that was an access to vote. So the disconnect, and I never saw myself up until probably 67 or 68 as even being politically aware, Fran. I mean, sports and baseball, and my parents were avid readers, so I read an incredible, I'd lived around the world, but there was still a certain naivete that I think was there. And I do remember my sophomore year, a young man named David Simpson and myself were in English class together. And I can't remember what prompted the topic or the conversation, but we began to have this free-flowing discussion of what was happening in America. And David Simpson was articulate and brilliant young man who later founded the Students for Democratic Society chapter here on campus. There's a photograph of Charlene Hunter Galt walking up the steps past the arches. Hamilton Holmes is out of the frame, but he's in the setting, and there's a white man spitting on Charlene. That's David Simpson's father.
It was interesting times, interesting times. I think you're right. In fact, I have a quote from the Pandora of about 67 or 68 that said that we went from red alpaca sweaters and alligator belts to dirty jeans and sweatshirts. And I think that represented the thought and the feelings too. Very much a change in the way the world was in those 4 short years.
Right.
So talk specifically about how we went from a system where it was Greeks versus independence to what ended up, was it 68?
68. Yeah. Thank you for bringing me back to the original
question.
That's
all right. No, that's all right.
And the reason I started, I guess, that longer tail and got myself distracted was that campus politics to that point had mostly been social politics. There really wasn't a lot of politics. And a fellow named Raleigh Harris, who ran and was president of the student body the year before I was, and I served in his cabinet. But Raleigh was very aware that the world around us was changing. And it was actually during his years, 67 and 68, that the first of the changes began to take place, significant changes. In loco parentis, a principle practiced on every college campus in America, in which the parental responsibility was transferred upon your enrollment into the college to the administration within that college. Dean Tate, the book we wrote was called When Men Were Boys, and the idea being that we were still boys when we came here, and so we needed a parent. And that's where the university functioned, and in loco parentis. But because so many things were happening around, that principle began to be challenged, and we started in 67 and 68 addressing things like women's curfew. You remember this.
Sign in and sign out.
Sign in and sign out. You mentioned a moment ago you had trouble making class from women's PE. If a woman on campus was going to her PE class, she had to wear, in the student handbook was quite clear, an opaque raincoat over her gym.
I guess we were going to incite the male students.
I
don't
think
know.
so, with those short shorts, which I think went halfway
hung
down
to your
thigh,
knee.
or down to your knee.
Practically.
Yeah, it was just, and so the treatment, at least in our perception, and of course, here we are at that age, and I'm sure we had rebelled against our parents in the same way, but the dichotomy was what was being expected on the outside and what was expected on the inside. The case that ended in loco parentis was actually a case involving a young man who siphoned gasoline out of a car in Cresswell Hall parking lot and was caught by the Athens police and arrested for theft. Taken downtown and booked, and was in the manner in which it was always handled then. They never put you in jail. They called Bill Tate or Harry Cannon or Bill Racewell by that time, I think, was even involved. And Dean Tate came and had a standing bond pledge, and he just basically bailed you out. That young man then went before the student judiciary, the student court system, and that's not right. He was first by Dean Tate. Dean Tate suspended him from school. We were midway into a quarter, I think fall quarter, so he would have been out, I believe, fall quarter and spring quarter. And that was Dean Tate's punishment. Dean Tate's belief was it was better to be suspended from college than it was to have an arrest record. But in these times, a 19-year-old man, he was 19 years old, went immediately 1A when in his draft when he lost his educational deferment. So if he'd have been tried in an Athens city court, he probably would have paid a small fine at most or a probated sentence. He would not have become eligible for the draft in a wartime. And so when this young man appealed and it went to the student judiciary, the finding was that Dean Tate's punishment was harsher than an arrest record, and he had no right to take that young man out of the civil court system and punish him on campus. I rode back. Dean Tate gave me a ride back to my dorm room that night. The transmission was push button on a Studebaker or something.
An old Buick at one point.
Maybe it was an old Buick, beat up. He was a terrible driver.
He drove over the. Yeah.
He could not understand why he had been overruled, and he wasn't angry. He was sad,
hurt,
and we talked for a minute. And I'm not sure he ever really understood that this was a kind of a change. Because again, remember what he did for me in my freshman year. Identified my failing courses and called me in. I mean, that's how involved he was in our lives. So the change was that the political climate on campus was becoming more the political climate off campus. And to think that we would do student elections around what fraternity or sorority you belonged to just didn't make any sense to me. And there were issues that were much bigger that in some ways, I think still there were those in the Greek system that just didn't want them. They didn't want to talk about integration. So that's why the change to the United Party.
I was going to ask.
Yeah,
it was the United Party, and it brought together the groups, the active independent folks, the active Greek folks.
That's correct.
And you formed a slate.
We did.
And the United Party came in big time.
It did, yeah. And I ran against Billy Payne.
And it was a new day.
It was a new day. And you know, I've obviously seen Billy since then, and we laugh about that because we had been very good friends prior to that. I don't know how much of our friendship got lost because he was active in student politics and outstanding football player. So, yeah.
Interesting days. Those were interesting days. I was going to ask you about the times. There was so much going on, and as we said prior to taping, that it's better as you look back, or you have a better understanding. The Vietnam era, and you talked about a 1A status. Talk a little bit about, as I recall, the day that they drew numbers and everybody got a draft number who was born in a certain year was a time that just brought terror to our male students' hearts. Do you remember that day?
I do. That was very late. I actually was graduating when that drawing took place. Most of us of my age had already made our commitments. That was really something which began to affect young men who 2 or 3 years younger than
Well, we had compulsory ROTC here, did we not?
We did. For your first 2 years, that's a kind of an interesting story. I took my first 2 years. I had no desire to be in the military. I grew up in a military family, it was a wonderful, experience, but I had no desire to be in the military. So I was taking the first 2 years compulsory, and only because it was compulsory. And I remember a phone call I made to my dad. I had been working summers. It was the end of maybe either spring or early summer of my sophomore year, and I had figured out what it was going to cost me to continue. And the way we could do it in my family was there was sort of 2 years that were paid for, and you could use it all the first 2 years, or you could spread it out. So I'd been spreading it out, hoping to keep that money and doing some jobs. Like I say, if you were an officer in the CAFI house, you got free room and board, so that was what was attractive to me. But I remember figuring out and calling my dad on the phone and saying, I figured out I'm just not going to have enough money, Dad. And I said, continue to work at the same rate I'm doing. I can't really work more and still do the classes, but I did go by the Student Financial Aid Office and ask about a student loan. And I think I had computed I would need $3,000, maybe $2,000, to finish out with what I was making, what they were paying, to finish out my college career. And there was dead silence on the phone. Now, a student loan back then had 0% interest while you were in school, and I think it was 0.3 or 0.4% after you got out of school.
Fabulous.
Yeah. And I realized at that point, being less naive than I had been 3 years before, because Georgia and a lot of things there, a lot of growing up, but I knew immediately that what my father wanted to say was, I'll give you the money, but he couldn't. So it was kind of one of those awkward things. Now, we talk about children of the Depression. I'm going to suggest that there are grandchildren of the Depression. And
I would agree with that.
Yeah, that my dad said, well, he said, Rob, if you took out that loan, you'd never recover financially. You'd never recover. $2,000, $3,000, 0.6%. So he said, let's think about this a little while. And so, fine. So about 3 days later, my dad called me on the phone and said he'd done some checking, and did I know that if I signed up for advanced ROTC and went through the program and got my commission, I could make that money. You got paid every month in your advanced because you were in the reserve. You got summer training, so you got paid a lot more than I got as a lifeguard, I think, at the time. So that's what I eventually did, Fran, is I signed up for senior ROTC. I got commissioned in 1969 as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Infantry. And years later, I reflected back that for my dad, it was less of a risk for me to become an infantry officer during the height of Vietnam than it was to take out a $2,000 loan.
It was quite a time.
It was.
We've touched a little bit on Vietnam, but there were so many things going on during the 60s. The changing status of women.
Very much.
Though the university had desegregated in the early 60s, there were a very small number of African Americans on campus, and I think back in the late 68, 69, the then Black Student Union had a list of demands that they had made. More student recruitment,
right.
Abolishment of the KAs,
right.
A number of different things. What do you recall? What for you stands out the most in all this? Of course, the other thing that we've not mentioned is there came a time there, I guess in '68, that Martin Luther King was assassinated. George Wallace was shot. It was a scary time. I remember on campus too, Went graffiti on the military science building, maybe.
It burned. They actually burned it at one point. Not
Things
to the ground,
but. Now, were you serving as president of the student body at that time, or?
I was.
Talk a little bit about the churning.
The
going on. The occupation of the academic building.
Actually, the academic building. So.
Talk a little bit about those times.
And I think this was the kind of increasing political awareness, is that one thing touched another thing. And I think the civil rights movement in America, which focused on civil rights for African Americans, touched off, and I'll tell a little story here, touched off the sort of awareness of others. There was a group called the National Student Association, which, because I was active on campus, I went as a representative to the National Student Association in 66 or 67, 1967. And the meeting was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and a group called Students for Democratic Society read something called the Port Huron Statement, and it was voted on at that meeting. And the Port Huron Statement was the foundation for what became Students for Democratic Society. It was written by a group of young men and women, mostly from the Northeast and upper North Midwest, who met in a little resort community on Lake Huron, and in the summer, and drafted this document. And that document began first with the affirmation of the civil rights movement, but then went on from there to begin to prescribe or describe what students, and it was the National Student Association, were from all over the nation, was what they felt were the rights of students. And I think this is just a direct continuation, awareness of rights. But more importantly, it was about social equality. And as you mentioned, Black Student Union here, if you looked at the population of African Americans in mainstream American colleges around the country, it was small. We focus on the South, where it was legally, at one point, legal to segregate. But there were the segregation de facto around the country. Women. A man being admitted to the University of Georgia, and this is true of colleges, universities everywhere, in 1965, had some 100-point less average SAT score than a woman did. Bill Tate, for all his wonderfulness, is actually quoted in a document that he wrote in which he said it would be fine if women would agree to major in home economics and journalism, he would admit more of them. Now, I don't know why journalism, but home economics and journalism. But he felt you should cap the enrollment of women because men had to
support the family.
Had to support the family. So you're right. I mean, we entered into this at a very unequal, and the story I was going to tell was that I can remember a meeting around basically student rights, civil rights, that was held one evening. It was a very raucous meeting, a lot of political rhetoric. It was about 2 weeks before the occupation of the academic building, which was, by the way, a march for women's rights.
That's right.
That's what prompted it. And the argument was going on and on and on and on and on until suddenly, from the doorway of this student apartment house where we were staying, kind of a wreck place, probably one of the old places over on Boulevard or someplace, a woman came, who was a member of this group, came to the door of the kitchen and said, "Well, isn't this fine? The women are in here cooking dinner and doing the dishes, and the men are in here arguing." And so you were aware just suddenly the equity issue was not just about white, black. It was about women, as you said. That was really what provoked the most of the demonstrations on this campus were around rights of women.
Dr. McBee said that at one point the women marched around campus with the rules in a little coffin. And that basically, that along with the occupation, basically ended in loco parentis. And that she said we weren't the first, but we weren't the last.
No.
And then she spent a lot of time responding to parents' letters. In fact, I think she said they sent out a letter that said we are no longer responsible, and got lots of concern from parents. But
parents withdrew students.
The days just were changed.
Yeah, they were. And you know, Fran, it was, and I remember having this conversation with politically active women on this campus, several of whom you would know, and being told from them, no, we got to keep the curfew. Well, why? Well, what would you do if you had a bad date?
That's a good excuse to come in.
You know, but there was again this juxtaposition. Just sometimes it was surreal. But yeah.
Well, let's talk about, on a lighter note, other memories of the time, and I just jotted down a few that I saw in a Pandora, Rob. And first fall season we were here, 1965, Alabama, and the Flea Flicker played.
Oh God, yeah.
In fact, that was the first. I believe that was the first game.
It was the first game. It was the first game of the season.
Coach Dooley had been here a couple of years, and
yes.
had been steadily getting better, and then all of a sudden,
yes.
bam,
yeah.
beat the Bear.
Yeah, and you know, and as you remember, the stadium was much smaller than it is now. In fact, from my room in Reed Hall, I could still see the football field at that time. You can't possibly see the football field now. Yeah, I remember it vividly. And I remember three things about that particular game. Was that my wife-to-be, her parents would not allow her to go to the University of Georgia because it was just too wild and crazy. So she went to Mercer. And I remember before I left my dorm area to go down to that football game, I went into the payphone on the hallway of Reed Hall and called her. And you know, we'd been dating about a year, and you know, asked her how she was, what she was doing, and she said, "Well, I'm getting ready to get on a bus to go drive 50 or 60 miles to visit John Mercer's grave." And she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm going to study."
You just lied outright.
I just did, because you could, the noise, I don't know why she didn't figure out that was a complete lie, but and I did have to confess later that I was in the football stand.
Blessed heart.
Yeah, that's right.
Homecoming, those great huge mammoth things that you put out of chicken wire and stuff on your lawn, the parades, the senior parades, and the hats and the. Now, do I remember correctly that our year, before it got to be our senior year, they canceled that because somebody had an obnoxious, crude sign
that
had appeared on television?
Yes, again, changing times.
I won't even go into what I remember that sign said. So, Rob, some of the unbelievable caliber of the visitors that we had to this campus, and I had forgotten, but as I reviewed, Hubert Humphrey, Eugene McCarthy, Julian Bond, Dean Rusk, who of course later became a part of our campus, Dr. Spock,
oh yeah,
John Kenneth Galbraith, Ralph Nader, Ray Charles, the Righteous Brothers,
right,
Bobby Gentry and Glenn Campbell, the Fifth Dimension,
and Tina Turner appeared at the wagon wheel on the Atlanta Highway before anybody even knew who she was.
Tina Turner was. I mean, it was just a time, and even out in the community, in the Greek community, some of the Little Richard, the Shirelles. I mean, the kind of folks that came in. Of course, these young folks now would not know what an impact that made on us. But do you remember anybody special? Did you work at the Union?
Well, the Union was just starting.
Right, it just got started right at the
I was their film coordinator when I was in graduate school several years later. Dr. Davison, President Davison's office called me and said that they had a guest coming to campus. It was Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and they wanted to do a campus kind of walk around, and they wanted him to meet some students. would I agree to come, and they had a lunch for us, and we met him and talked, and then we walked around campus. They're just the old quad some, and because I was student body president, that's why I got the invitation. So I agreed, and we finished lunch and began to walk in the old campus area. Dean Tate was with us at some point telling stories and whatever. Southern Sims was the dean of students and was with us, and Dr. Davis and several other people. The dean of the law school was there, and we walked around, and we spent about an hour and a half walking and talking and visiting places, and just was marvelous. And went back to the president's office and said goodbyes, and Dean Russ got in the car that took him back to the Atlanta airport, and we were walking away, walking across the quad, and Southern Sims turned to me and said, "Rob," he said, "you know, I know you're the president of the student body, but," and he had a smile on his face, he said, "I still don't think that gives you the right to call the Secretary of State by his first name." And there was a great pause, and I realized that I was using Dean Rusk as an honorific and not as his first name. And I had referred to him as Dean all afternoon. Dean this, Dean that.
I think he got that all the time on campus.
I'm sure he did. I was so mortified that I sat down and wrote him a letter of apology, to which I got a wonderful reply, in which he said to me in the letter, "Don't worry about it." He said, "I recently was on William F. Buckley's firing line, and Mr. Buckley did the same thing through the entire show," referred to him as Dean. And he said, and William F. Buckley wrote me a letter of apology. So he said, "You're at least in good company."
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But there were many that came. I think this campus was, and I think under Fred Davison, I think O.C. Adderhold, who preceded him, the growth on this campus and its national reputation was just skyrocketing. I'm not sure I could have gotten into the University of Georgia the year I graduated if I'd have been a freshman. I mean, the standards were just going up.
Well, that's certainly today. I can't tell you how many phone calls I get from
I know.
Friends whose children are not where they would like them to be. I'd like to talk a little bit about your life after the University of Georgia, realizing that there's lots that has gone on there, but I go ahead and talk a little bit about that. Rob, what happened? You went to graduate school, got a master's in journalism?
Well, I was commissioned in 1969 and had done training for 2 summers and had wanted to go to law school. And so I had applied to law school, not knowing exactly what status would be with the military, and was accepted to the University of Georgia Law School. So I requested a deferment in my commission to go to law school and then go into JAG, the Judge Advocate General's Corps. And I received that. And I received that with some promise that you know they would even help pay for that. So this is great. I entered law school in the fall. I think I was in classes 5.5 weeks when the Tet Offensive happened and the military
Rescinded everybody.
Began to re-ramp up. So I had about 6 weeks of law school and then went in, took my commission and went in. I was very fortunate. I was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division and was on orders to Vietnam when President Nixon began the withdrawal. And the principle of the withdrawal was first in, first out. So the 1st Marine Division was the first unit to go to Vietnam. They were the first to come home. The 1st Cav Division was the second unit to go, so they were the second to come home. So I actually helped them in their transition out of Vietnam to Fort Hood, Texas, which is where I took Diane. It was certainly not a garden spot. I remember getting a phone call shortly after I was there from a red and black reporter, a young woman asking me, "Is this Robert L. Williams?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is this the Robbie Williams who was president of the student body?" I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Well, she was calling former student political leaders to find out whether or not their being political leaders on campus had helped them get their first job." And I said, I don't think so. So we stayed in the Army until 1974, and then I came back out of the Army. I had some interest. I had actually started part of a journalism degree, so I had some interest in journalism, decided not to go back to law school, and I interviewed for a job at the University of Alabama with Mort Stern, who was a former editor of the Denver Post, and David Matthews was the president of the University of Alabama at that time. He was the youngest president, university president, and I was hired to run their public television station. They had just sort of put units together to start a college of journalism. They hadn't had one before, mass communication. Took the job, packed up my family, left Texas, put our furniture in storage to go to Tuscaloosa, went to visit my parents in Atlanta, where the phone rang one morning and it was Mort Stern. And he said, Rob, I'm calling you to tell you that Gerald Ford has asked David Matthews to be the secretary of HEW, and he's leaving University of Alabama. And the only reason I'm here is for David Matthews, so my wife and I are going to return to Denver, where he would assume again the role of editor of the Rocky Mountain News. He said, you still have the job though. Well, I realized I was going there for Mort Stern, and I had no desire to go there without that. So suddenly I was unemployed, and that's when I did come back to the university, taught some in the journalism school, and worked with the Cooperative Extension Service. And so that's what brought me back to the university.
We just got you on the rebound. Is that what you're telling?
Basically.
Well, talk about, I know the Kellogg Foundation Fellowship came along. How did that affect you, and how did that affect your plans?
Yeah. That was a significant turning point in my life in many ways. I'd basically been involved in journalism, writing, magazine writing, had done a couple of documentary films by that time. It's a Mean Old World, which was on Reverend Pearlie Brown, a blind black blues street singer in Macon, Georgia, actually won a prize at the London Film Festival. So I was sort of in that media track. And I did apply for Kellogg National Fellowship, which was a 3-year, all expense paid. I mean, they gave us basically $60,000 a year for travel. I mean, it was a phenomenal opportunity to do things and study. I had gotten the application. What had happened is that a coworker of mine, Virgil Adams, a wonderful writer here in Georgia, had seen a funny grip and grin, basically one of these where somebody's getting a plaque and you're shaking their hands. It was a very awkward picture, and he sent it to me as a joke, just funny picture. And on the backside it said that there was this opportunity to apply for a Kellogg National Fellowship. It was been in place 2 years. So I called up to Gene Yount's office and asked, because it said in the local, it was an Athens article, that you could get your application from the Vice President for Public Service. So I called Gene Yount's office, and I remember there was dead silence when I asked about the application. She said, well, we don't have any more. She said, but you can call the Kellogg Foundation and they'll send you one. So I picked up the phone, called the Kellogg Foundation, and said I wanted to get an application for this Kellogg National Fellowship, and there was dead silence. And she said, well, I guess I can send you one. So she mailed me one. And I got the application and began to work on it and fill it out. And I remember that part of the reason they were giving you money was they wanted you, it was really about multidisciplinary, sort of get you to move outside of what had been your specialty into something new. And so they asked you to write a no more than 2,000-word essay on why you wanted to move into this new area. I wrote about 200 words and ended it by saying, if I was able to write 2,000 areas, it probably wouldn't be really a new area, would it? And finished my application, was really close to the deadline, and took it to Dr. Davison's office to get him to sign it. And they said to me, he's not here. He's in Atlanta Board of Regents meeting. And I mean, the thing had to be postmarked like that day. And even the administrative assistant in his office said, "Where'd you get this?" And I said, "Well, the Kellogg Foundation sent it to me." So they said, "Well, he's at a Board of Regents meeting." And he had to sign it. I asked, could somebody sign from him? No, he had to sign it. So I got in my car and drove to Atlanta, sat outside the Board of Regents meeting till they finished and came out. And of course, I'd known Dr. Davison, so he recognized me. Spoke to him and I said, "Dr. Davison, I wanted to apply for this Kellogg National Fellowship and it needs your signature." And he looked at me and it said, "Where did you get this application?" And I said, "Dr. Davison, you're about the 5th person that's asked me about this. What? I don't understand why people keep asking me." He said, "Rob, they sent 12 to every major university in America, asked them to go through a nomination and selection process, give it to the 12 people they had selected, and those were the only ones that they would entertain at the foundation."
And you weren't in that pool.
And I was not in that pool. So I was just dumbstruck. And he said, "But you know what?" And he signed it. He said, "Send it in, see what happens." Well, I got it.
How about that?
Yeah, so it's just one of those things you sometimes never know but the selection process. But it really did. I made a move in that particular time into organizational psychology. Went back and got my PhD in organizational psychology. So really a kind of a change from the days where I focused on media to really what I've done now for the last almost 25 years. So
it's a great story. And we can talk more. We can talk about working with the Fanning Institute. We can talk about your new job.
Well, I mean, leadership development, and partly I was a product, I think, of folks who had what at the time I was growing up and first in college were sort of informal ways of leadership development. But I really did begin to focus on leadership development because I had always felt that there were things that were done for me or provided to me that were really kind of instrumental and
saw the potential and gave you a leg up, even though it may have been, maybe you didn't even realize it.
I think that's very true. I think that's very true. And I also realized that my experiences growing up in a military family and having a lot of exposure to a lot of different things, and that whole idea of sort of becoming a student of people and of groups. So really, for the past 25 years, it's been mostly about leadership development. Started with the Pew Center for the Health Professions, which was at Duke, and then to a consulting firm in the Research Triangle Park. But that's really what I've been doing. So the Fanning Institute was just a kind of another step. And now that I've retired, I have been rehired by Georgia State at their Center for Ethics and Corporate Responsibility. And again, it's mostly about that.
Isn't it nice that somebody wants you? Let's segue, even though we have already talked about, even though we've talked about Dean William Tate, let's go back in 1984. You and John English brought out a book, When Men Were Boys, An Informal Portrait of Dean William Tate. You know, we've done about 40 of these interviews and everybody has a Dean Tate story. Talk to us about how that came about.
Yeah, it was not too long after his death. And it was, I think it was just John English had been a long time friend and mentor in many ways. Worked with him on the documentary films. He was a faculty member in the College of Journalism magazine writer. John just has been a real special person. But we sort of were talking about this notion of individuals in your life or individuals in an institution's life who are both larger than life. They're just, and how much of that is a kind of a creation of a modern myth? How much of that is an accident of the time? How much of that is a unique character? And the more we talked about it, it just seemed to us that he was a fascinating individual. And so we began to collect the material for the book. And you say everybody has a Dean Tate story. We took out ads in newspapers throughout Georgia and the New York Times and the Washington Post. And the number of stories we got
poured in.
Just poured in. And as we note in the book, several of them are almost apocryphal. They're almost urban myths, because people would send us the story, but there were variations. The tank, some students stealing a tank and driving it through Athens. There are probably 25 variations of that story, even including what year it happened. So it was almost like some of these stories were then reclaimed by subsequent generations of students as they went through that happened in their time, or what was something. So he was larger than life. He was a fascinating blend of the Old South and the New South. He was an individual who, as I said, cared deeply about those students and what they did, but could be rough, could be very tough.
A complicated man.
A very complicated man. It's sad, and I wonder if I will live that long. I'm trying to remember the date. He gave all his papers to the Georgia collection at the University Library, but they're sealed. Oh, really? Yeah, they're sealed, and I may make it. It's a long time after his death that he asked for those to be sealed. And if they're anything like pieces, he kept a daily diary. If they're anything like pieces he has read to me on times or talked about at times, I don't think he's kind to everybody in this, and I think that's the reason for doing
How interesting.
Yeah.
What's your favorite Dean Tate story?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think my favorite Dean Tate story is the night of the riots at Myers Hall, when the integration of Charlene Hunter Galt and Hamilton Holmes occurred. And I did a lot of the research on that, spent time with Charlene and Dr. Holmes as well, interviewing them about what happened. The former Athens City Police Chief was still alive when we were doing the book, so he was able to recall a lot of it. But that to me was probably a night that it made all the difference in what happened here at the University of Georgia. It was not a pretty sight, obviously. It was not the way that any of us would want this university to be remembered, but there were no significant casualties. It was, he maintained control. And the expression in there that one person used to describe him was him wading into the crowd of students, demanding ID cards, snatching them left and right, putting them in the pocket of this big overcoat he had on, and just, quite frankly, just subduing what was a crowd out of control. The Athens City Police Chief said there was no way they could control them. They were out of control. They were throwing rocks, bashing cars, stopping cars on Lumpkin Street, burning things. He said that without Dean Tate, it would have been a full-fledged riot. So that to me is the kind of the mark of the man. The funny stories, there's just so many of those. The funny ones, and including the ways that he sort of had of differentiating students. He used to say he could always tell when it was an out-of-state student. He knew Georgia students. He knew students from Georgia. He said it's a dead giveaway when they come to your office requesting in-state tuition and you ask them where they're from and they say Winder instead of Winder. He just and the whole notion of he said the Southerners still flinch whenever a Yankee lights a match. I mean, he had this wonderful, wonderful way of recounting stories, and each story had a purpose. I mean, I remember that first visit in his office. There was a lot of story in that, and he used story almost
he was a parable teller?
Yeah, almost like a parable. Absolutely, absolutely. And it was very Southern, but at the same time, it was very universal. So I really wish he had written more. He was encouraged to do so and never really did. We don't know what'll be in those papers, but
I told him one time when I was working, and he at the time was working for the Alumni Society doing tours and things, and he would do a parents tour every afternoon.
Right.
And he would do some tours for us, and I said, Dean Tate, I'm going to write that article for the Reader's Digest, I'm not even remember, the most interesting person I've ever known, or the most. I did not see him again for the next 2 years that he didn't ask me when I was going to write that story. Do you remember a story about the young Grinnell student who had an automobile accident? It was one that just jumped out at me. I had never heard it before. And Miss Artow, Dean Tate had heard about the accident, maybe even on the radio, and went to Miss Artow. Miss Artow said the student had permission from the dean of Grinnell to be there. I mean, it was back certainly in loco parentis. And she had lost an ear in this automobile accident.
He went out and found it.
And he went out and found her ear. And somebody said, how in the world did you find an ear? And he said, well, I knew what I was looking for. Just an amazing kind of a fellow.
He was. And often he would be doing this. I have the visual in my mind, is that he would be out at night in this big, whenever it was even close to cool, he wore this big top coat, Chesterfield type coat, almost to the ground, like mid calf. A fedora hat, he was a great hat wearer, and he would have his striped pajamas and bedroom shoes on. I can't tell you the number of times that he would be seen on campus at some important point dressed so.
Truly one of the ones that will live on. Changes over 40 years that you see in our alma mater.
Well, I already mentioned a moment ago the national reputation and the scope of what this university's come to mean. And you mentioned you had heard from kids' parents about not being able to get in here as the standards. And throughout all of higher education, public land grants, like the University of Georgia, created primarily to provide education to kids who couldn't afford it. I mean, the land grant system were the first of the public schools in America. Everything had been private universities up to that point in the 1800s. Those big universities, and there's probably 20 of them in America, and the University of Georgia is among those. They've moved from being state universities, they're national universities, and that has not come without pain, because we often look and say, well, this was the flagship university of the state of Georgia. Well, it's no longer that. And we find kids who are dying to go to Georgia Southern because they have a great football team, or kids who are dying to go to name any other kind of institution. And they have become more the state schools, and Georgia has become more of a national university. And there's a reputation in that, but there's a piece that's lost. I imagine if you walked across this campus and just stopped and interviewed every 10th student, finding a kid who grew up, they'd be more like me, kids who'd come to Georgia. Parents moved here when they were in the 10th grade, or they're from Indiana, and it's just a very different blending of people here. So the focus is on national reputation, some of the things that used to be a part of this university. I think if Mary Montgomery or George Marshall was on this campus today, I would have nowhere near the access to them that I had in 1966, 67, 68. And that's not, I don't think I'm being unfair to current faculty members. The pressure on them to to perform their research and to be in a nationally competitive field where grant dollars are few, and they in some cases put out 10 to 12 grant applications for every one they get. It's just it's a very different competitive world.
Different world.
Yeah.
Accomplishments of which you're most proud, and I know Diane and Justin and the babies
would be
are part of that, right up at the top.
Yeah. I won't list Diane as an accomplishment because I think it's the reverse is true. I hope she would say that that I was one of her best. Diane's a great adopter of stray dogs. She's been part of animal rescue for many years. People ask me, well, how many dogs do you have? And I said, well, there were.
When I left home.
When I left home, there was. But I do often say to people, I was the first stray that she picked up. And obviously Justin and Suzanne, to whom he's married, and those grandkids, obviously. You know, I got a call the other day from a woman who worked with the foundation, and I'd done some work with that foundation. And she called to say that she'd just gotten this new job. She's actually now going to be the vice president of a major American foundation. And she referenced a leadership development program we had done for foundations with the Council on Foundations. And she just began to say that that had caused such a change in her life. And so I realized at that point, well, that and another thing that happened about the same time. A friend of mine is a photographer, and he now has a website called Why We Do What We Do. And he has gone around a very eclectic group of people, and he's done photographs with them holding a little sign. And there's, on that sign is just a few words that are about why I do what I do. And they're great photographs. It's one of the best photographs I've ever had done. And I'm holding a little sign, and it says, I love a story. Because when he asked me this question, because you had to write something for the website on why you do what you do, is I realized that the constant theme in my life as I look back, journalism, organizational psychology, just many other things, the English, the writing, is I love a story. And I love the stories that I get to learn with people when I'm involved in executive coaching or leadership development. I love the stories when I was doing documentaries, when I worked at the Georgia Center, where we had a radio station and did those kinds of interviews there. And I married a librarian along the way. So I just love a story. And why I do what I do, and my sense of accomplishment is learning people's stories. I think that's
great. Great. What's your best UGA memory when you were in school?
Oh, God, there are some. Well, it had to be a night in Memorial Hall as they were reading out the returns on the student body president election. Yeah, I think that was a high moment for me.
Certainly should have. You certainly have had a full, rich life, and as I said that to Dr. McBee, she said, "It ain't over yet."
Yeah, I was gonna say.
And it ain't over yet, Rob. You got a full, rich time to come. But we thank you for being with us today and sharing with us.
Well, thanks for doing this, Fran. It's something, and again, it's something we don't think about doing until the stories are all gone away. So, thanks for doing it.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah.